The Anvil Terrapin is your first step into the exploration specialization of ships, of going out into the unknown and surviving it. The Terrapin is built to be very, very durable over most other things. It's not really for combat, it's not for cargo. It's for finding things, for exploring, seeing what's out there, and living to tell about it. As that first leg into exploration, the Terrapin is a relatively modest ship. It's not too imposing, which I actually consider one of its strengths. It gets to go into uncharted territory, and if it comes across someone else who's also exploring, or he comes across aliens or natives, it is not this imposing war ship. It's there to see what's there to find. It's got a scanner array and it's got heavy armor, but aside from that, it doesn't really have any offensive focus. So if someone sees you, they know that you're not here to pick a fight. In the current iteration of the flight system, everything is kind of the same in that the thrusters that you have, they have different uses, and so we'll allow this thruster to contribute a certain amount of thrust and not that thruster because they're specified for different uses, but the reason that they're specified for different uses is still being implemented. And part of that is the heat factor, which we don't currently take into account with our thrusters. We have it in a lot of other systems, but we're still getting everything built out. And when thrusters overheat, they'll start to have error, and they'll start to have give you less thrust than you expected, or give some of that thrust in directions that weren't intended. And so that's going to make your thruster systems a lot less reliable once they start to overheat. Your maneuvering thrusters are designed for instantaneous thrust, high output, immediate action, and then hopefully, because you're in space, not needing to follow it up. Maybe follow it up with a different action on some different set of thrusters that'll allow you to counteract that motion or augment it into some other more advanced maneuver. That's fine in space because you get to carry that momentum. When you're in atmosphere, when you're under the influence of gravity, you have a constant force to negate in order to stay up in the air. And maneuvering thrusters aren't meant to be able to take that kind of load, not indefinitely. For a couple seconds is fine, but in order to be able to really just hover in the air, you want to have VTOLs. You want to have sustained thrusters, or sustained thrusters. So the Terrapin will be able to point its mains down and be able to stay up indefinitely and avoid overheating, as long as you don't do anything too crazy.
So my job on the Terrapin was building out the interior, which was pretty difficult considering that a lot of the concept art we had for it had to be changed to match the new Anvil style guide. So I got to really hone in on what Anvil interiors look like. It's the first major actual walkable Anvil interior that we have. The original didn't really have a distinct look. A lot of manufacturers, if you look at Origin, they got a lot of big bubbly shapes that kind of are reminiscent of Soviet aircraft. The Anvil has a lot of exterior shapes that are very recognizable. Everyone knows that Anvil dome and the big angular shapes. So when we wanted to go to the interior, we were looking a lot at the angles, and we came up with the idea of this hexagon pattern like that. And then you have the floor plane, which is lifted up inside of that. So a lot of the stuff that makes Anvil interiors unique and exteriors is 30-degree angles everywhere, hexagons everywhere. It's made to look kind of like Star Wars meets Aliens. Some of the things I had to create for the Anvil interior were component boxes. I had to design out the dashboard, which was really fun because Anvil has a lot of analog controls. It's still a little bit more sleek than Drake, but it feels very like bulky and militaristic. I'm really proud of that joystick that I made. It's actually designed off of a Warthog joystick. Inside the Terapin, you got the scanner array, the chair. The chair that rotates, the support chair, I did a lot of the initial work on it, but it really came together when Elwin got his hands on it and kind of took it the extra couple steps. It's a really cool chair. We had to completely redesign the control panel that comes down, because originally it was just in front of you and it'd fold up, but we couldn't get it to look right. So we ended up having it come down over you and act kind of also as like almost a seatbelt.
When I first get my hands on the Terapin, it's just come hot off like the artist plate, right? So what I do is I look at the damage plan for it and I try and figure out where it needs to break apart and how I need to set it up and make sure it works. So for the Terapin in particular, when I was looking at the damage plan, I realized that it has a pretty unified shape, so I had to look for a lot of dangly bits to kind of break off. Luckily, it has the 4 thrusters, it has some panels, control consoles, the door can break apart, the nose tears apart from the body, which rips apart from the tail. In each of those chunks, there's the vis areas, so I need to make sure that when the nose and the tail rip apart, the pieces stay, things disappear. Yeah, and all the damage has its LODs, making sure that every piece that breaks off also decreases in quality as it goes away from the camera. So making sure that the Terapin, for example, has mounted weapons and those weapons fly off with the correct parts, you know, like just going through all the checks and balances of the ship. Can I walk in and press the button, turn the ship on? Okay, great. Can I walk in, have a seat in the seat? Does the character's hands look okay? Do I have to send it back to animation? You know, I'm just taking a look at the Terapin and just from the player's standpoint perspective of I plop in game, I walk up to the ship, press the button, door opens, go into the ship, look at the passenger seat, hop in the back, and under the radar dome, there's a player seat. In the front of the ship, there's a seat. So you're just kind of going around and making sure that all the functionalities there that design has put in, making sure all the parts that design has put in are loading in. Just general feature checks and everything. And the Terrapin's looking so far so good. The art's looking really nice on the damage side. It's got lots of nice details under the surface. And the effects are looking good too. Still needs a few tweaks here and there. The overall damage system isn't done yet. We've been implementing, I don't want to say necessarily a new tech, it's the item 2.0 thing everyone's been hearing about for a while, but basically we're converting a lot of items to item 2.0. What that means is basically they existed as one form and now they exist as another form. But a weapon's a weapon, a thruster's a thruster. But when it comes from the tech art standpoint, when I'm doing the damage setup for the Terrapin, it's got, say, 5 or 6 parts. It's got the body, which is the whole ship, and it's got attachments that load in separately, like the thrusters and the radar dome and the door. All those need to be kind of stitched separately into a UV2 sheet. So I talk with art and I talk with design, I find out what parts are going to be this way and what parts are going to be pulled in that way, and then I go in and I make sure that everything is kind of working together. But so far, art's done a bunch of changes I requested recently, and the model's looking much better from a damage standpoint. Functionality standpoint, still work in progress, but otherwise the Terrapin's looking really good. So the changes I in particular requested for the damage system, since I first get the ship and when I get it, nothing breaks off, right? It's just like, shoot the ship, nothing kind of happens. So the artist doesn't necessarily see what it's going to look like at the end until I've done my initial pass. So I went in, I shot up the Terrapin, and I blew off each part, and I'm like, okay, well, when the thruster leg detaches from the body, what kind of like metal and wires and stuff are sticking out of the hole? Does it look too flush? That was kind of my first thing. It just kind of looked like an empty cavity. And I'm like, hey, could you just add some more stuff here? Because if a modeler adds, say, wires or pipes or tubes, my initial particle pass is going to be like, oh, what cool damage stuff did the guy add? Did he add wires? Add some sparks there. Did he add some tubes? Well, maybe there's some gas venting out of there, you know? So the artist helps me define what the initial prep is going to look like, then my initial prep helps the final guys do the polish. So once I had the ship breaking apart into its 3 main pieces, I could say, well, the body doesn't detach from the nose well enough, it looks a little too flush, could you add a little more randomness to, say, break up the silhouette against the light, stuff like that. And then after a few days of revision, I got it back and I'm just keep it on going. And it's just kind of back and forth revisions. So it's usually when I'm not working on one part of the Terapin because I've either finished it or requested changes, I'm working on another part. I can always jump around. It's not like I'm just doing art or just doing design. I do a lot of checks. I check the shields on the Terapin, make sure that works, the UV2s on the Terapin, general functionality like controls, seats, animations, destruction, lighting, you name it. If it's part of the ship, I have to check and make sure it works before I can sign off.
Of course, there's no promises with this. We're still exploring this. We're still building it out, and we won't really know if it works this way or delivers the behaviors that we're hoping for until we actually see it in game. It just gets really exciting when you see something line up the way that, like, I bet we could do something with that. So we'll see how that goes. Among other interesting things about this ship is I got to set up, it sounds dumb, but it makes me really happy that I set up a light switch in the Terapin that's correctly integrating with our power system and correctly integrates with our light groups to set it from the on to the auxiliary behavior. And it uses the new interaction system, and it's a simple thing, but it makes me so happy to have something so simple in-game and reacting the way that you'd expect it to. When the ship loses power, those lights go off, and that light switch doesn't help. When the ship is in emergency mode, you can turn the lights off, but the emergency lights aren't a part of that system, so they keep going. Everything behaves the way that you'd expect it to, and it's these early examples of systemic wins that really are really nice reminders of why we're building things the way that we are. So that ultimately it's as simple as make it the way you expect it to be made, and that it behaves the way you expect it to behave. It's just really nice when that happens, when we get to the point where a system begins to exhibit those systemic behaviors.